Welcome to the second session for English Literature A-Level. And tonight you're going to study Unit 3 Poetry. And before I let the lesson start with Miss Kathy Davis, I just want to point out on the question and answer on the chat, I will have put the link in order to get all the recordings for all the sessions, okay? Hopefully that will be useful. So, croeso nawr I Miss Kathy Davis.
Oh, good evening, Year 13. So yes, continuing from last week, what we're going to be focusing on now are more the unit-based tasks. So the poetry analysis and more than anything, the unseen aspect of the poetry task. First thing we're going to be looking at is just a little bit of quick revision, looking at some of the key literary devices that you may sort of come across. I'm sure that a lot of you are quite familiar with these anyway, but we just need to make sure that we're not forgetting the basics when it comes to our analysis. So we'll just quickly have a read through them, go through a couple of examples and sort of look at why it's being used. So alliteration, so that's the occurrence of the same letter sound at the beginning of kind of quite closely connected words. So things like sweet singing, bravery, baffled, that type of thing, okay? And obviously what you'll find with the majority of these is that it's here to, the purpose of it is to draw emphasis and to highlight a certain idea or a certain emotion or attitude that a poet wants you to consider, okay, is all to have an impact, okay. So then we move on to onomatopoeia. So the process of a word imitating or resembling or possibly even suggesting a sound. So things like roar, bang, crash. Assonance then is the repetition of identical or similar vowel sounds. So your vowels are A, E, I, O, U. Okay, so things like cold, bold, wet, set, taste, paste, feel, real. They're the sort of things you'd come across with the repetition of the vowel sounds. Metaphor is when you say something is something else. Okay, often this is the one that candidates will confuse with simile. So a metaphor is not using that comparison of like or as like a simile does. It's saying that something is something else. It becomes it. Okay, so for example, hopefully you'll all be coming out and saying, oh, that exam was a breeze. He is a pig, the world is a stage, okay, they're metaphors. So when we're thinking about a simile, like I was saying, that's a comparison of one thing to another. And often you get that using the words like or as. So sweet like chocolate, as strong as a bull. So that's where the comparison is made. Hyperbole then is an exaggeration and definitely used to evoke strong feelings or strong emotions. Okay, that's what the purpose of the hyperbole is, that exaggeration. Pathetic fallacy then most commonly linked to weather. Okay, so poetic description which attributes to human emotions, and like I said, often associated with weather, this one. Okay, so maybe things like the clouds were sullen, or there'll be a detailed description about the weather where the pathetic fallacy is being used to maybe contribute to mood and atmosphere or like attitude or tone of a poetic of the writer, okay, of what their approach is. Then we have personification. Again, you're probably quite familiar with this one. So where you give human qualities to inanimate objects. So the lightning danced across the sky, the wind whistled, the alarm clock yells at me. The alarm clock doesn't actually yell at you, although I do feel some mornings that it does yell at me. And then you've got the final one, which is the use of repetition. So where you have repeated words, repeated phrases, even repeated ideas, which would form what we call a motif. Okay, and again, these are used to highlight or to emphasize a certain aspect or idea the poet wants us to consider. Okay. So things that we need to think about. So what does it mean to analyze a poem? Okay, so we're trying to figure out what the theme of the poem, okay, how the poet uses literary devices, so figurative language, imagery, repetition, symbolism, to make their point about the theme in the poem. So what is it about? All right, that's what our purpose is. So first things first, you have to understand what the poem is about, look at different elements, so figurative language, imagery, repetition, symbolism, or if it alludes to or links to something else, the tone or the mood, so the way it makes you feel, and then if there's any use of rhyme or rhythm throughout. Annotation, again, something which is often overlooked, but this is a skill, and this is a skill that you should develop throughout the course of your your time in your English lessons from year 7 all the way up to where you are now in year 13. So it's that ability to mark a text as you read it, and most definitely, like I said, one of the most important aspects of the analysis. So when you're approaching the poetry, you should be encouraged to underline the keywords, okay? Ask questions of the text. So what is it trying to do? Okay, so associate things like this makes me think of something, okay? So link any material that is similar with arrows. Look at chunk pieces of text, so look up big parts of the text, okay, instead of just individual words and phrases all of the time. Use questions to guide your reading, so make sure you're aware of what your question is, and that things like looking at sentence structure and organisation, so the way that the poem has been put together, okay. When it comes to the unseen, which is possibly the most complicated or difficult aspect of the Unit 3 paper, you're going to be expected to synthesize and reflect on the knowledge gained from the course as a whole, okay? And then apply these skills, the literary analysis that you have developed, to unseen poetry texts, okay? Approach poems or extracts in a personal and engaged way, and demonstrate your own critical skills, okay, in analysing these texts. So when it comes to the examinations that involve the unseen text most definitely are quite daunting, okay? It's a challenge, but in order to be successful, you've got to make sure you change your focus a little. I think we're so used to sort of shoehorning information into our brains, learning AO3, learning AO5, making sure that we've got quotes sort of at our fingertips. This is different, okay? This is where the creative aspect comes in, okay? So away from that memory-driven test to one involving the creative application of skills and knowledge. So the skills that you've developed when you're analysing prose in year 12, when you were looking at your NEAs, okay, now in year 13, they're the skills that you need to be honing in on, okay? And as with any physical journey into the known, the process starts with preparation, planning, and the right equipment, okay? So you've got to be organised. That's the point I'm trying to make here. So when it comes to the division of your approach and the way you go about it, it's possibly helpful to go about it in 3 different ways. So stage 1 would be your reading, stage 2, the kind of reflection process, and stage 3 is your responding, so you're answering, okay, when you put the essay together. So each of these 3 stages most definitely requires an application of a certain set of skills, okay, and like I said, these are skills that you most definitely should have developed over the course of year 12 and up until now in year 13. So the reading part. Okay, so at the beginning of the examination, priority here is going to be careful, open-minded reading of the unseen poem. Remembering you've never come across this poem before, okay? It's very unlikely that you'll have seen it before, and the fact that you're open-minded is going to be really important. So timing, I'm going to reiterate this, and I said it last week. Your own personal reading speeds are something you really need to be aware of. You need to know how long it takes you to read a poem, an extract, etc. Okay, so you've got to understand your own personal reading speeds before the examination and factor that in. Focus, vital that you're kind of mentally uncluttered, single-minded. Attention is totally on the text, okay, and not worrying too much about how you're going to end up putting it all together. Okay, and then your interpretation. So we're engaging with the main characteristics of the poem, as in the way it's structured, and kind of what the obvious meanings are, tone, sound, the tempo, the pace of it, the rhyme, what the key ideas are more than anything, and sort of just think about what you feel, your own personal reaction when reading the poem or the poetry. Again, there's this emphasis on timing, okay, so don't rush the process, okay. It's really easy to just choose the first poem that you come across, or the shortest poem, or the one you think, yeah, that's going to be easy, okay. It's better to spend your time making a really careful decision rather than halfway through going, oh gosh, I'm done, I've got nothing else to say, and having to change your mind halfway through your written response, okay. So test yourself. If you've got 45 minutes to answer on this particular section, think about how you're going to divide your time, okay? You're going to make sure you've got time to choose your poem, read it closely and make your annotations, and then obviously you write up your response. Okay, so what I've got coming up next are 2 poems that you could potentially choose, okay? And think about how long you take to make an informed decision once we've read through both of them, and which one would allow you to write quite thoughtfully. Okay, so we've got 2 poems here, one Temporarily in Oxford by Anne Stevenson, and the other one by Babette Deutsch called Urban Pastoral. So we'll have a read through both of them. So Temporarily in Oxford. Where they will bury me, I don't know. Many places might not be sorry to store me. The Midwest has right of origin. Already it has welcomed my mother to its flat sheets. The English fens that bore me have been close curiously often. It seems I can't get away from dampness and learning. If I stay where I am, I could sleep in this educated earth. But if they are kind, they'll burn me and send me to Vermont. I'd be an education for the trees and would relish, really, flaring into maple each October, my scarlet letter to you. Your stormy north is possible. You will be there, engrossed in its peat. It would be handy not to have to cross the whole Atlantic each time I wanted to lift up the turf and slip in beside you. Okay, so that's Temporarily in Oxford. We'll have a quick overview of each in a second as well, okay? And then Urban Pastoral. More domestic than elegant, leaves and pigeons hedge the dazzle beyond. Green, dust, a purple strutting, screen the river's march. The walks are for pigeons and ladies like parched pigeons, avoiding the bench where a tramp rustily sleeps. The carriages in the park are babies now. Children make all the traffic. Spring brightly travelling, summer half awake. Here the afternoon city plays at being a dream of summers, gaiety and repose. Lazily festive as post the holidays, a dream. Crossed by the tramp, browsing. On paths where sparrows edge to snatch the breadcrumb for the humble pigeons, the holiday is broken and scattered. Yet a strong green still throngs the boughs, and the river, preened, goes twinkling past all these birds, on to the salt sea. Okay, so Temporarily in Oxford is just a female speaking to what we assume is a partner, contemplating sort of her life after death. So what will happen to her? Where will she sort of eventually end up? And she's sort of toying between being in Oxford. She's toying between maybe going to Canada. She's toying between kind of the Midwest where her mother was, okay, and up north. So here there's this element of contemplation being presented. And with Urban Pastoral, what you've got there is sort of the contrast of kind of country and city life, and how almost what Babette Deutsch is saying here is that there's this sort of there's a merge between country life and city life, and how that's sort of emphasized through sort of seasonal changes. Okay, so we'll have a think about those. So consideration when you're having a think, when you're making your decisions. Okay, so at this stage, you shouldn't be involved in any form of detailed analysis. Okay, but what you should be considering are some of these questions. So what's the effect of the title? What is happening? Who is speaking? What kind of poem? What type of poem is it? What's the tone of the poem? Are there any striking images that are being used? Is there a specific structure or form being used? So, for example, is it separated into a certain amount of stanzas? Is there a certain rhyme scheme? Is there use of sonnet, etc.? Okay. What are some of the ideas that are being considered in the poem? All right. So there's things you need to be really thinking about when you're in that stage of contemplation and consideration. So it's important here that you don't just search for and spot sort of techniques. Okay. Oh, great. I found a simile. Okay. You need to know why the poet has used it. Okay. So try and get the main ideas that the poet would have wanted you to be considering, and then reflect on it. Okay, this is what we need to be thinking about. So let's have a think and say that we have chosen that second poem, Urban Pastoral by Babette Deutsch. Some of your initial impressions might be things like the strangeness of the title. So those juxtaposed ideas, there's two contrasting, conflicting ideas of the urban, okay, which means town, city, and pastoral, which is linked to the idea of countryside and nature. So you've got two very opposing word choices and two opposing ideas being presented. there is a real strong sense of description and an awareness of surroundings. There's the recurring use of birds, so references to pigeons and sparrows, ideas of spring, talks about kind of dream-like, linking to sort of the verge of summer, and the use of repetition as well. And then you've got this mixture of disparaging and complimentary comments, okay, so quite negative, derogatory comments at times, and then, you know, real quite sort of stark compliments at the same time as well. Okay, so they're things that we should be considering. So then we get to this next sort of point where we're going to start to reflect and we're going to start to annotate. So in that first stage, you identified what was in the poem, okay? Now we've got to think about is how, okay? So you now have to address how Dote has achieved what you're reading and what it has revealed to you. So in the work that you do now, your annotations, okay, this is what's really important now, okay? The work that you're doing, your annotations, are most definitely going to dictate and impact the quality of what you write when you get to stage 3, okay? So the emphasis here needs to be upon analysis rather than a description or just a basic commentary on what's going on, all right? We don't need a plot overview, we need an analysis. You've got to remember the AO2 aspect here, the language analysis, okay? Thinking about trying to be perceptive, trying to look at detail, looking at words and meaning, okay? So the following is not an exhaustive list, but the types of things that you could have included or you could think about. So the title should be an excellent starting point. So by the exam, you should have an understanding of the different forms and genres of poetry. So the word pastoral should alert you immediately to the type of poem you're reading. So what is the effect of the title here? So we know it's called urban pastoral. So most definitely what we've got there is that impression of conflict, almost as though like there's two worlds which are colliding. And this is what she's writing about in her poem. The opening line in the first sentence should also build on the effect of the title. So you should be looking closely at language. How are the types of words used to complement in the title? So again, what you've got in the opening in the first sentence there is these negative assertions that are being made about the surroundings. Again, the poet is expressing possible personal viewpoint at that point there. You might see that there are patterns of words being used. In a second, we're going to look at an annotated copy of the poem, okay? So we'll have a look at words which are highlighted in red, okay? And we're going to think about how do they add to the ones in the title or the ones in the opening lines. And what they do is that they just simply provide us with juxtaposed or quite uncertain and conflicting images, okay? There's a sense of uncertainty and uneasiness being presented. What about the poet's use of birds? So all of the bird references will be highlighted in blue when you have a look at the next slide, okay? So why this focus on them, okay? And what I think is that the bird choice reflects the setting and location. It's almost as though there's a sense of ownership and belonging from the birds, okay? The pigeons. The pigeons are strong figures and strong characters there. It's almost as though they're stagnant. They're not able to sort of move on, or they don't want to move on, quite possibly. Okay, I'll just quickly skip to the annotated version. So like I said, there's the red there, and then you've got the blue, the references to the different types of birds there in the blue. And then if you look at the words in red, what you've got is quite conflicting images. So domestic and elegant, the hedge and the dazzle beyond, and you've got then the dazzling dust. And then you've got the reference to like the traffic and the parched pigeons, broken and scattered towards the end there, yet strong. Okay, this idea of strength. So you've got a lot of conflicting images being presented, okay? Also what we've got within this poem are references to other characters. So how are they being used? You've got use of women and children, and sort of the use of female figures, which are sort of pushing prams around, okay, which reflect the kind of hustle and bustle and the relentlessness of city life, okay, because that's what she's focusing on. She's focusing on the life that's going on within a city sphere, okay. There are some other repeated phrases, so what are they, what difference they make? So you got the repeated phrase of summer, pigeons, the seasonal references, water, and we just get the sense about the city almost coming to life through the nature references, so the idea of spring almost here. The tone, does it remain the same? Does it change? Where does it change? Why does it change? Okay, so very negative initially, okay, the tone of the poem, but then towards the end you've got this comment on the throngs and sparkle, and there is this element of positivity, and I've noted there this element of acceptance perhaps, and then we think about the sounds within the poem, okay, so do they add the ideas at any point? So alliteration is really clear, as well as the use of onomatopoeia. Okay, there is no rhyme, but there are other structural points you could make. What could you say? So I'd most definitely think about the use of sentence structure. There's a lot of line run-ons, so the use of what we'd call enjambement, so where the line runs on from one sentence to another in order to continue an idea, and that structure is definitely purposeful by the poet here. Okay, a definite intent there. And then the ending of the poem. So what does the poet want to leave us with? Definitely this romanticized notion of the city, okay, which started off sort of in this sort of grey haze, and most definitely there's like some romanticized imagery that links to that as well, okay. So like I said, there's the annotated version of the poem. Sort of what would be nice is that if you have a chance, if you could complete the task that's at the bottom, so take the same approach, going through those kind of pointers with the other poem, okay, so practice looking at poems that you're unfamiliar with. That's the only way you're going to be able to sort of increase speed and familiarity with techniques and approach, is if you practice again and again, okay, so you can use the other poem and take that same approach with Stevenson's poem. So as you reflect upon the poem this way, you will most definitely begin to generate some purposeful annotations, okay, and help you spot patterns in the poem, and then obviously will allow you to organise your response as well, okay. So by noting that the relationships in words and images, you'll be able to offer much more sort of acute observations, stronger observations about the poet's technique, and it's not just sort of just like a little kind of checklist. Most definitely one of the markers of a sophisticated approach, okay. Like I said about the use of a bulleted list, okay, or basic flow diagram should be all you need in addition to your annotations, okay, but your annotations is what's going to be extremely important. So then we move on to, you know, the be all and end all part, which is stage 3, the written response. So you've had a think, you've kind of looked at kind of how you're going to go about things with regards to your annotations, okay. And in order to write successfully, you must be quite sure that you recognise the differences between 3 different kinds of writing. So what you're going to see in a second are varied approaches to this task, okay? Only sort of snippets, and we'll have a think about kind of what's good about them, what's bad about them, and have a think about which approach would be most rewarding for you with regards to the marks for this part of the examination. Okay, so here you've got the descriptive approach. So this poem by Babette Uch is a description of a city in spring. The poem doesn't rhyme and is written in free verse. The start of the poem describes that the city is more domestic than elegant. It says that the ladies are like parched pigeons, which is a simile. Pigeons are often referred to in the poem, okay, and then there's some commentary there, okay. Rather a weak opening, it most definitely struggles to go beyond the surface meaning of the poem, and although the candidate has picked up on some of the main points, so things like the city in spring, the inclusion or use of pigeons, the analysis is very, very limited. There's comments on poetic techniques, so rhyme, free verse, repetition, simile, but there's no real consideration about kind of how they're used to create meaning, and therefore the commentary is unnecessary and really redundant. So if there's use of pigeon imagery and it's repeated, there's a motif. What is the purpose of that? What does that make us feel. What is the author trying to do? What is the poet trying to do? So these are things, there's another step that needs to be made here, and that another step that needs to be taken by this particular candidate here. Okay, so already we're thinking that we need to sort of avoid the descriptive approach quite possibly, and make sure that our approach is a bit more detailed. So the commentary on meaning then. From the opening line of the poem, Urban Pastoral, Rebecca clearly doesn't like the city. Instead of being elegant, it is domestic, which shows that it's not a beautiful, romantic place. This is confirmed when the poet describes pigeons, hardly the most elegant of birds. The fact that they block what I presume is the river or sea in the distance, hedge the dazzle beyond, adds to this feeling. Okay, so commentary here then is, yeah, this is a little bit better. Okay, it is going through the poem, but it's a little bit sort of stunted, sort of kind of point by point as opposed to any fluency. Candidate is making some points, noticing some ideas that the poet might have considered when writing, and attempts to build on it looking at language. Okay, so just the zooming in of the domestic, looking at the hedge, the dazzle, beyond. Okay, and that's where what you've got, there is some awareness of implied meaning. So implied meaning is sort of meaning that's a little bit hidden, and you've got to really look for it. Okay, so it all depends on your own individual sort of perception of a certain aspect. Okay, so better than the first one, but still not what we'd be wanting to see in a good response to an unseen. So here what you've got is the analysis and evaluation where techniques are being merged. Okay. The poem Urban Pastoral begins with a seemingly derogatory comment regarding the urban landscape, which is more domestic than elegant. Deutsch avoids the romanticized idyll of the traditional pastoral and plays with the idea as she explores the urban landscape. Okay, so here what this candidate is doing is looking at kind of genre and what pastoral poetry means. Okay, the traditional genre of pastoral poetry is romanticized, it is idyllic, it looks at nature in a really kind of glorified manner. And this is what this candidate is doing. There's zoning in and zooming in on like aspects such as genre as well. Okay, so Deutsch avoids the romanticized idyll of the traditional pastoral and plays with the idea as she explores the urban landscape in a deliberately unromantic register and tone. Okay, so register and tone, referencing sort of the choice of phrasing, the diction choice, the kind of atmosphere, mood and attitude that's being presented. Instead of melodious birds, there are pigeons, described haughtily, strutting and obstructing true beauty. Hedge the dazzle beyond. The dazzle seems out of bounds, out of reach, and the repetition of the pigeons throughout the poem suggests that they are everywhere, spoiling any beauty that might be enjoyed. However, despite the deprecating tone of the opening, Deutsch also recognises there is beauty even in this urban world, and at the end there is a sense of energy in the verb throngs and romance in the twinkling of the salt sea. Okay, so there's a real sense that this candidate is tracking here. Okay, so we can see the response is a good sense of overview from the outset. Most definitely there's an awareness of the poetic tradition being understood and used by the poet, okay, in the way this is played in the opening lines and in the title. As a result, there is also a confident understanding of ideas, which will be beneficial as I seek to explore how those ideas have been created as they proceed with the analysis and the evaluation. Most definitely what we've got here is a clear sense of the poet's craft being at the centre of the poem. So the poet's craft is, what are they trying to do? What is she trying to achieve is what we need to be considering, rather than just a passive description of a scene, which is what we saw in that first response, okay, that passive description. The analysis may not be fully developed at this point, but there's also some close analysis of language and poetic techniques and the way they've been used to create meaning, okay, and awareness. So that last line, for example, sense of energy in the verb throngs. So just the verb choice, okay, and how it it's an energized verb, and then the use of romance in the twinkling of the salt sea. So choosing individual words and phrases, making sure they're zooming in, making sure there's an awareness of what language can do and how it can impact the meaning. Okay. So here we've got another poem, okay, so this is called A Poison Tree, written by William Blake. Possibly some of you will be familiar with it, okay. I'll have a quick read of it, and there's a task then for you guys to do, hopefully if you have some time. I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow. And I watered it in fears, night and morning with my tears, and I sent it with smiles and with soft, deceitful wiles. And it grew both day and night, till it bore an apple bright, and my foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine. And into my garden stole, when the night had veiled the pole. In the morning glad I see, my foe outstretched beneath the tree. Okay, so I've put a quick commentary there, okay. Poison Tree is a short and deceptively simple poem about repressing anger and the consequences of doing so. So the speaker tells of how they fail to communicate their wrath to their foe and how this continues to grow until it develops into some sort of poisonous hatred. The speaker describes how they were angry with a friend, they talked to their friend about the issue which helped them overcome their anger. However, the speaker was unable to do the same with an enemy, and this leads to developing resentment and an even stronger degree of hatred. An extended metaphor of a tree growing in the speaker's garden demonstrates how the anger continues to grow. In the lines, and I watered it in fears and I send it with smiles, the speaker actively cultivates the tree and anger. Eventually the anger blossoms into a poison fruit. The enemy eats the fruit and dies, and the speaker seems to be glad of this. However, there is also a sense that they see the destructiveness of what has occurred. As the first lines acknowledge, we can easily overcome our anger if we communicate it properly. Okay, so the task that I'd like you to do is just to provide a critical analysis and evaluation of that. Okay, so you've got an overview telling you the types of things that Blake was trying to achieve, but it's you picking out key phrases, key words, the meanings, and picking up on any technique that you see evident and prevalent in that poem, okay? So just then to recap, what do you need to do? So candidates will need to demonstrate your ability to articulate and inform personal and creative responses to poetry text. So there's your AO1, most of this links to AO1, okay? Analyse how meanings are shaped in poetry texts, how writers adapt structure, form, language, so language choices. So obviously there's your AO2, the analysis aspect. Show understanding of ways in which poems relate to one another as they compare works by different poets. That'll be your AO4, which we'll be looking at more next week, is the comparisons and the connections. So use accurately a range of literary concepts and terminology, identify and consider how attitudes and values are expressed in text, organised response in a clear, effective academic style, and register and coherent written expression. So how will you be marked? So you'll be required to respond to one question, okay, and there'll be a comparative analysis of two poems taken from any period. So one compulsory poem, okay, or poetry extract, and then another one that you choose from 3 poems, okay, a choice of 3. So this is that's the hard bit, is the choosing of the poem, the making the selection. So A1 15 marks, AO2 15 marks, and AO4, as you can see, it's been put in bold. It's doubled. You've got the 30 marks for AO4, which is the connections that you make. All right, so like I said, next week we are going to have a look at the connections. So you need to focus on the way that meanings are shaped and the connections between one text and another. So things to remember, you need to make sure you've got engaged analytical writing with relevant connections being made, okay? Misinterpretation would be to construct lists of points of contact between texts. Connections can only be made, are only going to be valid when they're based on the language analysis of both texts, okay? You're better to have a few really fully developed connections rather than sort of making sort of offhand superficial links, okay? Quality is most definitely important than more important than quantity here, okay, when it comes to the number of links. And then here what I've got is a suggestion of a possible approach, which I'll look at a little bit more next week as well, okay? So underline the keywords in the question to start with, okay? Then you'd read your compulsory poem A, all right, and possibly start to annotate poem A, all right? So by underlining the keywords, you're highlighting your focus, okay? What are you focusing on? Then what you'll do once you've read through poem A, you're going to think about reading your 3 poem choices, okay? So how long should you read for? How long should you annotate for? Possibly 10 minutes. Again, it's all dependent on your own personal timing with regards to your reading speeds. Then you'd make your selection of your second poem. So what's important is you read all 3 poems. Like I said at the start, you don't just pick the shortest one or the one that looks the simpler, okay? You've got to make sure that you understand poem A in order to think, right, okay, how am I linking this to my chosen poem? All right, so you select your second poem, you plan and you structure your response, okay? You keep them balanced, keep the balance of the AOs in mind, all right? So you got your initial focus on A with gradual integration of that second poem, then integration of both poems from the outset, or separate analysis of both poems followed by connections, okay? So the choice or the approach is up to you, okay? There is no right or wrong. The only issue that we see quite often as examiners is that if you do a separate analysis of both poems followed by connections at the end, if you run out of time, you're missing your connections, and when it's double weighted, like 30 marks, okay, here, then that's going to pose a bit of a problem, okay? So I would say the first 2 bullet points, so starting with A and then gradual integration or integration of both poems from the outset would be the best way to go with regards to timing, because obviously the weighting of AO4 and the importance of it could possibly pose a problem, okay? And then obviously you write and you check your response. Okay, but we will, like I said, go over this again next week. That's all I've got for you this evening, Year 13, and hopefully I'll see you again next week. Thank you. Good night.